Hello, people. This is the Extra Spicy Podcast. I am Justin Phillips.
And I'm Soleil Ho. On this show, we talk about food and what it all means by speaking with people in the Bay Area and beyond who are writing and thinking about how what we eat shapes us and connects us. On this episode, we speak with Adahlia Cole, an adult industry professional in the Bay Area and owner of the popular food blog Hungry Hungry Hooker.
Food and the adult industry are so much about pleasure and comfort and hedonism.
And we'll give you some advice on your questions about food and restaurants.
Dear Spicy, what should the food industry look like after the pandemic?
Ooh, there's like 1,000 answers to this.
Some of you might be wondering, why are you guys talking to a sex worker? But I think that she has a lot of really interesting things to say about the connections between food and sex and food service and adult service. She's also one of the really most interesting food reporters that's out there. Even though she's not a traditional food reporter, she does a lot of reporting on food, if that makes sense. Yeah, no, I think she's got so many amazing and fascinating things to say about the parallels between those industries, and I really hope that you, if you know very little about that industry, learn a lot from this. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we start, would you mind just telling our listeners your name, your occupation, and your pronouns?
Sure. My name's Adahlia, and I am an adult industry professional in the Bay Area, and I also run the food Instagram and I guess now a website, Hungry Hungry Hooker.
So this is a really interesting pairing of interests, right? You have a day job like many food bloggers and influencers or people who are really into food. For me, what's interesting is that they're both kind of at the confluence of consumption, which I find really I don't know, it's fun, it's cool, it's interesting. It's a lot more relatable than someone who's a data analyst during the day and then they go to Michelin-starred restaurants by night. That's a little bit less relatable, maybe.
Well, I think both things, food and the adult industry, are so much about pleasure and comfort and hedonism. And those things go really well hand in hand. And I think there's a lot of correlation, or at least similarities, between working as an escort and working front of house and fine dining.
Yeah, tell me more about those similarities, because you've worked in the restaurant industry.
I have. I've never worked in fine dining, but I did work in restaurants for, I guess, from the time I was about 14 to the time I was maybe 22. And I was also doing sex work concurrently. For a lot of that time, because I think, as we all know, the cost of living in the Bay Area is astronomical. And despite the fact that I loved working in food, although I mostly worked in kitchens, but a little bit front of house at, somewhere that was kind of fancy fast casual, but really never anywhere at, certainly nothing like Michelin starred or World's 50 Best or anything like that. Although I love eating at those places, but I think that service at that level and sort of the upper echelon of escorting have a lot of commonalities, just as far as you're dealing with rich people. You got to be massaging rich people's egos all day long. And things are, there is a very exacting level of service and kind of things that you need to do, and a similar clientele that you're dealing with. There are some differences too, because even though both people are honestly, I guess, the help to these very, very wealthy people for the most part, although I will say I do also have some very lovely clients who are working class, who save up to see me, and who I'm so thrilled and always really, really incredibly grateful that they choose to spend time and money with me. But there is the difference in that there is the optics of I'm still out on a date with someone, so maybe the way that I'm treated is a little bit different. But for me, there is a level of performance involved, and I know that I'm not on a real date with someone like I would be in my personal life. Although I do have a great fondness for a lot of my clients, especially at this point. And I do have a lot of clients now that I have a much more natural, real relationship with. But, it is still a paid service that I am performing.
For sure. It's a lot it makes me think of, because I worked in retail, and food a lot too, and you perform a lot, right? You can't really have a bad day because that cuts into your actual income. your tips go down or, whatever, or, you're sent home because you're grumpy and you can't smile for the customer. And I assume it's pretty similar in that way.
Yeah, I mean, my husband works in restaurants still, and we often sort of joke about the fact that I'm sucking literal dick and he's sucking metaphorical dick. I mean, you have to be on and happy to see someone and smiling and thinking about their needs and their wants and fulfilling those things, even if you're having a really shitty day.
I feel like that might have been the realest quote I've ever heard on a food podcast.
Are you overwhelmed? Is this a lot?
Yeah, my brain is exploding. I do love the idea of discussing, or I guess maybe drawing a parallel, like a through line between sex work and retail work. So what do you think about that?
I think that it's super interesting to hear cross-industry solidarity. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
It's really, really cool. She's all about that. And of course, right? She is a worker. Just because her work is not what we as in like society at large, right, consider to be respectable or above board because we've criminalized it.
Right. Right.
Doesn't mean she doesn't have really poignant and like really interesting things to say about labor and what it means to be a worker right now.
I mean, there are things that all industries go through. If you strip everything else away, like whatever your perspective may be of what is only a fraction of what Adahlia does as a person, like if you strip all that away, like across the industries, like workers all want the same things. Like we want to be paid better. We want our work situations, both physically and mentally, to be better. She has a great perspective on all of this. Like she crosses so many lines, I think.
Yes. And I think the fact that she's married to a restaurant worker and she's worked in restaurants herself, she has those opportunities to make those parallels. And I think that's also why she gets along with so many restaurant people, too. I think on her Instagram, especially, you'll see a lot of interaction with sommeliers and servers and chefs and cooks. They all are hip with it, which is cool. The more someone pays for a restaurant experience, it's like an amusement. It's a ride. It's the kind of thing where like you're paying X amount, so you better have a really great time and it better be amazing.
Yeah.
And if it's not, like for some reason, I think that feels like more of a like disrespect almost, or like a violation, which I find really funny when it comes to, money things. If we're looking at a Venn diagram, right, of the people who go to fine dining and the people who go to sex workers, is there a center to that diagram?
I mean, I think it's just people with money who want to pay for, I guess, a luxurious experience. I mean, I think that just because of the access to the funds to do those kind of things, I mean, that's probably the biggest part of the Venn diagram, is that it's people with money. I think for me, I have found there is a huge overlap, but that also is probably skewed by the fact that my branding is so heavily influenced by how much I love to eat, how much I love to cook, my love for restaurants. And then I talk about that stuff all the time. And because of that, I find a lot of clients who also love to do those kind of things. And, I do a lot of stuff where I'll set up just like a really elaborate food tour for people in the few different cities where I feel comfortable and knowledgeable enough about the dining scene where I can do that. And I know enough chefs and I can, do all these special little things. And so because I do that, and because I do like private chef dates and that kind of stuff, I tend to get quite a lot of people who love fine dining and who want to do those kind of things. But I have a lot of friends whose branding has nothing to do with fine dining other than maybe occasionally posting photos of their meal. And they still do a lot of that stuff. So I think it really has to do with the financial class of people and what is normal for that financial class as far as the overlap.
That's really cool. That's part of your branding, is that you appeal to gourmands. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's been a really healthy thing to do in my work life because I tend to have the kind of clients who are really interested in the same things. So there's always a focal point of things we can get excited about together. Whereas, I do have a lot of friends who, it's like any job. You see people who you love and you see people who you loathe. And I think that's just like working in restaurants. You have regulars that you are so stoked to come sit in your section and that you'll come and bring little extra free stuff to because seeing that person makes you feel good. And I'm very lucky that I'm at a place in my career where if I don't like someone and I loathe them, I never have to see them again. And I feel very lucky to have incredible, wonderful repeat clients who I so genuinely look forward to seeing. But certainly earlier in my career, I saw a lot of shitty people I didn't like. It's a service industry and hospitality industry position. Just like working, I mean, it's not just like working in a restaurant, but there are a lot of correlations.
I think the metaphor is pretty potent all around. And you've also become a regular at a lot of luxury restaurants around the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's another point that I want to touch on, which is that the community of people working in restaurants are also a lot of freaks and not, I don't want to say outcasts, but there is like a lot of weirdos in the industry, just like there's a lot of weirdos in my industry. And I've always felt, even beyond when I was working in restaurants, very accepted by that community. Maybe at most kind of had a little bit of a feeling that I was like a little bit of an interesting oddity, but I've never felt persecuted by anyone who works in a restaurant for my job, which is, often, as far as jobs go, it's a pretty marginalized one. But, I also obviously have a lot of other privileges that protect me societally and systemically, which also offset that. So I want to pay some service to that as well, of course. But I've always felt very accepted within the restaurant community, and that's been really wonderful and allowed me to really dive into that and really make that my branding. Whereas I have a lot of friends who are also escorts who are incredible fine artists or who also work in tech and are brilliant coders, and they could never tell their work communities about that. And I just really appreciate that the restaurant community has always just been super accepting and there for me. And the places that particularly make me feel good are the places I go back to, are places that I have felt respected and go back to again and again. And I think that I hope the restaurant community understands that escorts have financial power. We are going on work dates again and again and again. There's
Right.
only so many fine dining restaurants, but we're different clients. So we're going to go back to the places that we like and that make us feel good and that don't make us feel shitty because we're there obviously on a work date. And we also talk. So, I'm really lucky to have knowledge in this sphere. So I have a lot of friends that are like, hey, I've got a client. This is what he's into. This is what he's not. What restaurant should I go to? And there's a restaurant that I really love that I started taking note of how many times I'd eaten there and how many times I had sent people there. And before wine, I know that I am responsible for over $22,000 in sales just in food alone since they opened about 3 years ago. Like escorts have financial power. Some of us have a lot of cash, some of us don't have a lot of cash, but we all have clients with cash.
So I wanted to pause here and just highlight the really interesting way in which she articulates how she gets to know people in the industry. Like they relate to each other, they're all weirdos, and it gives her a really unique perspective into the food world that I think a lot of food reporters, like seasoned ones whose job it is to do this,
Yeah.
don't necessarily have. They don't have that perspective.
And there's this thing like, I don't know what it is about journalism, but we assume that everyone has to fit within this specific box. Like most publications will hire people as long as they have X, Y, and Z.
Right? They went to the right school, they look the right way, they're a culture fit, whatever.
And I think what we have to come to realize is that food coverage benefits from people that aren't from these traditional backgrounds. Adahlia has more contacts than I guarantee you a lot of really great food reporters across the country do. And she probably has better relationships with those sources because they talk to her differently. It's so weird that you have to describe something as looking outside of the box. But I think journalism benefits from not adhering to the structure that we've had in place for so long.
Yeah. And when you think about, for instance, restaurant criticism, right? And the way in which you are thought of as having knowledge of fine dining or like a sort of good taste, right? Like good taste is something that's cultivated through time and with a lot of expertise and through experience. But how do you get that experience? You know what I mean?
So how did you get it?
by working in the industry, actually, working in fine dining restaurants and
Gotcha.
being on the other side. But at the same time, rarely I would go to these restaurants where my friends worked. And then I was able to get like subsidized meals or they wouldn't let me pay because, we were colleagues. And that was how I was able to check out these places without breaking the bank.
This is why Anthony Bourdain's passing was such a big deal to me, because like we didn't travel a lot when I was a kid. Like, we didn't have money to go to like really nice restaurants to, build up my understanding of how like a Michelin starred place would function. I didn't get any of that stuff. Like I would watch a lot of like travel shows, and occasionally if my parents like splurged on something, like if my mom's job had an event at a really nice place, I would go. But I definitely think I relied a lot on like food and travel shows really before I got of an age where I could like save my money together and go out on my own. Yeah, it's just kind of like you cobble together enough perspective to be able to talk about it.
Yeah. What I think is really cool about Adalia's story is she's probably gone to so many more fine dining restaurants than like most people.
Oh, for sure.
But it's so easy to not respect her. Not to say that we don't, personally, like me and Justin.
Right.
But in general, it is easy to discount the knowledge that she's gained through her work and through her experience because of the job that she has. I think that would be really foolish, actually. You're listening to the Extra Spicy Podcast. We'll be right back after this break. I'm Soleil Ho, and I'm back with Adahlia Cole, an adult industry professional and owner of the food blog Hungry Hungry Hooker. I wanted to talk about the project that you were doing on Hungry Hungry Hooker, which I think was fantastic and wonderful. And of course, it certainly allowed me to find out about a lot of really interesting things. I remember you telling me about this project, which was highlighting the side hustles of laid off restaurant workers, of chefs, of cooks, servers, sommeliers, and what have you during the coronavirus pandemic. And so they were doing like what? Selling bread, selling arepas, selling all kinds of things on the kind of gray market of Instagram. And I would love to hear about what was behind that idea and just how it was received.
I, just as someone who is also in an industry that is being deeply affected, I have no idea when I'm going to go back to work. I mean, I can't imagine in-person sex work is going to be easy to return to safely for quite some time. And I don't really know what I'm going to do. I also know that as the type of worker that I am, I'm lucky to have a little bit of savings to hold me over. I also, had my apartment for a really long time. So I am in a pretty lucky position. My husband works in restaurants, as I've said, so he's laid off right now. So it's a little bit of an interesting experience, but I can see how difficult it is for people who work in restaurants, especially in the Bay Area, where I believe I don't know if they exactly call it the poverty line, but like you're low income in the Bay Area if you make less than $120,000, I believe. It might be for a family of four, but it is an astronomically high amount of money compared to most other places in the country. And I mean, I know line cooks are making $18 an hour. It's maybe 20 or 22 at a place in the city that it really cares about their workers and making sure people get like a quote unquote fair wage. Because I mean, even that, it is hard to live on that. No one that I know in kitchens is doing a great job of being able to save money every month. And most people that I know that work in kitchens are living in apartments with several other people well into their 30s. It's not very sustainable, and it makes it really hard to save for a rainy day, let alone an indefinite time period of worldwide health crisis. So I think that one of the things that I think is really cool also about both sex workers and about restaurant industry folks is there's a lot of mutual aid that goes on. I see a lot of people really trying to promote each other, help each other out. Someone who has more giving something to someone who has less, and that person will pass it on down the line. And also, people in both industries are extremely adaptable. This is a crazy situation, and a lot of people are scrambling. And I think that we're both communities of people that are pretty good at landing on our feet. And it's a scramble. It is a desperate panic scramble, but it's also something that, people are used to solving problems, and seeing people start out of their own kitchens while they're laid off, all of these like really cool side hustles to support themselves and try to like get something else going has been really beautiful. And I really love that. And I really respect and admire that spirit and perseverance. And for me, there's not that many things I have to offer. But I have a platform and I can pay people for their food and promote it and talk about it. And I think that not just the food community, but people as a whole really responded to this list when I started putting it together. And it's still being updated. I actually have an update to do later today. But yeah, it's still being updated and the response has been really great. And I've seen other people starting to make other lists. There's a friend of mine who is starting to do a list of all the cocktail delivery spots in New York right now. Really excited to see that when it comes out. And completely unrelated, but there's these kids, Jason and David, who I saw like a post on Reddit about what they were doing, where they made a list of all of the small and mid-sized farms who have been super affected by having all their restaurant accounts be evaporated overnight, and who also are now doing direct delivery to people's houses, which is such a blessing for people like my mom who are, a little bit older and immune compromised and, it's hard to go to the supermarket, but still want really good, high quality, fresh food. And I saw that and I was so stoked. And I am really glad that I was able to send their info to a couple people that I know that have like a much broader reach and that they were really supportive.
Yeah, I found so many really cool businesses and just like people. I've met so many cool people through those lists and then through doing my own digging, which is, you inspired me to keep digging through Instagram and all these other like alternative modes of advertising. And, like in this time when it's so hard for places to promote themselves or the ones that like don't have the benefit of people walking down the sidewalk anymore, right? Like it's even more critical to get that stuff out. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. I put a lot of work into it. So I appreciate that people have responded well to it and have liked it. And I'm glad that we've had some of the same favorites on the list.
So I think Adahlia explains this pretty well, but I just kind of want to go over it again. So side hustles, basically. What are they? Why do we like them?
Right.
What's the point?
Well, I mean, it's the job on top of the job, right? Like if you're not making ends meet, or if you just want to like build up a little bit of extra money, it's the extra job you take. And usually it's not like you're a banker who takes a second job as like a banker, right? It's something that's a little bit more informal. It's an actual hustle. Like you got to try to make money off of it.
Right. And in this time during the pandemic when people are out of work, many of them have been waiting on their unemployment checks for weeks.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or the money's running out.
Yeah.
Or they don't qualify for unemployment because they're undocumented. Or. They have so many reasons to do these other things on top of it. And, the licensing for permitting for cottage cooking, which is legal in California, but you need a permit, has completely halted. So even if you wanted to pursue a new venue, like make little cakes at home to sell, you can't do it legally.
Right. Right.
So a lot of these places, a lot of these people are just really just skating by on goodwill and really doing their best. They are professionals and they know the standards and they want to stay healthy and want to keep you healthy too. It's been really interesting to see everything that's emerged right now.
That's the thing. So we're talking about things that emerge right now. What are some cool like side hustle food businesses that you've come across? Like I feel like you've been doing some exploring.
I definitely have, in part because of Adahlia. She really put a lot of them in front of me. I did a story recently about a few months ago, I guess. God, we've been doing this for a long time. About Singaporean businesses that have popped up during the pandemic. There are 3 that have really emerged. Dabao, Singapore, Makan Place, and Nora Heron has been doing some cooking in Oakland. Super good, super delicious, a great opportunity for people who are mostly immigrants who don't really get unemployment and need to work but aren't getting that kind of hours that they need to like make a living,
Yeah.
And then there's this guy who delivers arepas by bicycle, or actually he has a friend doing the deliveries now because he's gotten so big. And there are people who are making pies out of commercial kitchens that
Yeah. Yeah.
are of restaurants that have closed, for instance. It's really interesting. There's so much, and the food is really, really good too. I haven't been disappointed yet.
See, and that's awesome. And this isn't, we should point out, this isn't a new thing. Like, in the Bay Area food scene, there have been people who have had side hustles for the longest. Like one of the most popular, a Mission District icon in San Francisco was the tamale lady. It was Virginia Ramos, who unfortunately passed away not too long ago, but she would sell her wares outside of like bars and stuff, and she became like, everyone knew her. Everyone knew who she was. And then if you leave the Bay Area, like you got places in LA, like in Compton, with Trap Kitchen, who was, it's like this kind of like hip hop influenced soul food business that started out, as a side hustle and became this huge thing. I don't know. I mean, some of the greatest places start off like that.
Yeah, and it's really important to note too that a lot of the people who do these traditionally are people who have been otherwise shut out of the food industry, right? And shut out
Right.
of, air quotes, legitimate business because they can't get credit, right? They can't get loans from banks. They don't have the money for a lease on a commercial space. And so they just take to the streets. You see this all the time with the people who are like grilling hot dogs wrapped in bacon
Yep.
downtown.
Yeah.
The people who are making pupusas outside of churches on Mission Street. It's just the people do this not because they want to do stuff on the street, but this is the venue. Like when we talk about the food industry as a meritocracy,
Yeah.
this is how it manifests.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like people are going to find a way to cook food and sell it.
Yeah. And that stuff be hidden, boy.
Is there anything you'd like to shout out? Where can people find your work? What is the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, you can find me, the main spot you can find me is on Instagram at Hungry Hooker. I'm also on Twitter at Hungry Hooker. And I do have a website, but it's pretty new. And, I'm having a hard time connecting my domain. So it's still www.hungryhooker.squarespace.com. And you can find the list there, as well as in my Instagram highlights, if you want to look up the Bay Area's list of pandemic side hustles of laid off cooks.
Awesome. I love a list, as you know, and I love your lists. And thank you so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And that was Adahlia Cole. Next up is our segment, Dear Spicy, where Justin and I answer questions from listeners and lizards and dogs and cats and hell creatures from a hole in the Antarctic.
God.
Well, if there are any hell creatures, actually make my wish true and actually write in, please, because I want to hear from you.
So the first question is, Dear Spicy, what do you think about foie gras becoming legal in San Francisco?
So technically, right, it's legal to sell and cook and like sell once it's cooked, but it's not legal to be made or something. What is what is this?
From what I understand, California businesses still can't sell it, and chefs can't give it away, but individuals can buy it.
For delivery.
Yeah, it can be shipped to them.
Man, that is really convoluted.
See, that's what I'm saying. That's why I hate this fucking shit. It's so stupid. So
tell me more. Where is this rage coming from, Justin?
I'm frustrated with this storyline because between 2015 and 2019, when I think it popped back up on menus, like a repeal brought it back onto menus, then between 2017 and 2019, like there was a back and forth between foie gras supporters and people who didn't want it served. And it is very tiring because as soon as this news breaks, you feel like this is it. This is the definitive thing. This is where it's going to stand. And then a couple of months later, maybe like a year later, you end up writing the same story. It's just very bothersome.
Yeah, all this over some goose liver.
Look, I get it. Like force feeding ducks or geese, I guess.
It looks weird. It looks weird.
Yes, it's an ugly practice, sure. But from a journalism standpoint, it's just the back and forth is just like, good God. Let there be a definitive decision that has no gray area. Like let's just decide.
It's complicated, and honestly, like, it's delicious. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need it, and I understand that a lot of, there are farmers who depend on the industry for their livings. At the same time, it's just so interesting, right? That foie gras is the symbolic battle, whereas there are so many hens kept in battery cages to lay
Right.
eggs. There's so
Right.
many, you know, pigs that are just beaten to death.
Right.
um, it's just a really interesting fight for us to fixate on all sides, right? People who are pro or anti. It's an odd one, an odd duck.
Yeah, exactly.
The next question is, Dear Spicy, what should the food industry look like after the pandemic?
Ooh, there's like 1,000 answers to this.
Right? I mean, we did a pretty fun, big story about the future of restaurants. I think everyone's doing these stories. And I think we're all excited about the idea. But it's also like, no one's really asking what the future of water parks is after the pandemic. I mean, maybe somebody is.
Yeah,
But there's something about like the investment in restaurants as like a cultural icon that makes people so fascinated.
One thing that I am hopeful about is that you and I have discussed some of the programs that are helping fund restaurants during the pandemic. And some of them have these caveats that the restaurant, well, I won't say some, but there are these programs out there that have these caveats where the restaurant has to increase its diversity within its workforce and promote and, promise to pay fair wages and.
Right, the High Road program.
Yeah, the High Road program does that. And I don't want to say that there's not another one out there, but my hope is that if those things were to proliferate and there were going to be more of them and more restaurants, because all restaurants need money and more restaurants sign up for these programs, who knows, like maybe unintentionally we could see the industry improve itself because it needed this money. Does that make any sense? Like somehow these programs would make it to where all the things that you and I discuss when it comes to like the fair treatment of workers and what we want to see, like it could happen through the pandemic because these places are signing up for these programs. These programs have these stipulations attached to them.
I mean, it's so interesting. Like the many visions that are competing, right? When restaurants are just kind of scrambling to exist.
Yeah.
It's like, do they have time for this program? Like,
right.
And these stipulations, not to say that the program's terms are bad. I think it's very wise and very good to think about diversity and inclusivity and fairness and equity in restaurants, certainly, of course. But it's just a really interesting ask to make right now when many of them are just like treading water.
Yeah. My hope is that assuming that, everything goes right and we see our way out of this, if restaurants are still trying to use these practices that they were told to use after all this is over, it could be a good thing.
Right. I mean, there's so many big questions about what people like diners are going to want too after the pandemic. Will they want hot pot or fondue or Korean barbecue or, in Wisconsin, there's this restaurant that I talk about a lot that serves spaghetti on a table. And they just like, pour the spaghetti on the table, right? Like, are people going to want that anymore? I don't know. I think the things that are trending prior to the pandemic are probably going to exit pretty soon. Like communal tables, for instance. Certain family style cuisines.
I don't think beer gardens are going anywhere in the atmosphere of dining at a beer garden, which is usually like, on-site brick pizza oven or like food trucks that are around there. I don't think those are going to go anywhere. I think those will probably become even more popular, even though they already are popular right now.
Yeah. But. Well, and I think like the trends of contactless delivery and takeout are going to stay really strong. I think people actually like that. Although it's the culinary equivalent of having sex at a glory hole. It's just really not a lot of service.
Go on.
Not a lot of consideration happening.
Right, yeah.
It
It's
is
not,
just sort of impersonal, unfortunately.
it's not a lot of
Pick up, drop off.
intimacy. Yeah. I just want this pandemic to end, man. We'll get to the other stuff later on.
Yeah, for sure.
So the next one is Dear Spicy. As food eaters and journalists, what do you miss most about restaurants?
Oh, it's a sad one.
Yeah. All right, Soleil, what do you miss?
I miss when you go to Korean barbecue and the nice lady cuts your meat for you with the big scissors.
That's really cute.
I miss that part.
You know what I miss? I miss waiting for a group outside of a restaurant, seeing them, like being able to like exchange hugs and stuff, like that fun moment of everyone arriving. And I also miss not being terrified of crowds. Maybe that's more of what it is. There was like an innocence to thinking about going to a brunch spot if you were in the mood that day and getting there and it being hella crowded and you being like, this is cool. Like having like a brunch thing with friends.
Every time I'm in a somewhat questionable scenario lately where I'm at the park or maybe in line for the grocery store and someone fucking coughs, I just freak. I like lose my mind.
Yeah. Well,
and I hope that ends. I'm so tired of that.
I mean, God forbid that you're the person that does it too, though.
Oh,
like,
God, yeah. Like, I have allergies, right? And, like, my sneezes are epic.
Yeah.
And disturbing.
See, I did this thing one time where, so I sprayed my mask with this, bacteria killing spray one day. And, I, parked right outside of my apartment. So, I like put a different mask that I had on, go to the car, take it off. And I'm like, when I go to the store, I'm going to put this other mask on. So I get out the car, so I put the mask on, get out the car. I'm in the store and I start breathing the fumes from the spray because I didn't give it enough time to dry off. And then I start coughing. And I'm like, it was it's such a weird experience when you're like, God, I know everyone. My eyes are watering and stuff because I'm trying to hold it in, like killing myself so people don't think I'm sick. It's what world do we live in now? This is nuts.
Well, you don't want to be one of the plague people.
Yeah, one of the plague people. Yeah.
And just to make light of it, but really there's a stigma and you don't want to be at the tail end of that.
Yeah.
Ugh. The day some nice strange lady cuts up my meat, I'll be the happiest girl in the world.
Aw, getting that meat cut up.
On that note, now that we've been talking about meat, that is indeed all we have for today's episode. Thanks again to Adahlia Cole for being in conversation with me. You can read the transcript of the interview with Adahlia at sfchronicle.com/spicy.
And remember to send us any questions or voice memos or skywriting or smoke signals you have about food, life, or anything else that you're obsessed with for our Dear Spicy advice segment at extraspicy@sfchronicle.com. Thanks everyone for listening.
Extra Spicy is part of the San Francisco Chronicle podcast network. Erica Carlos is the producer of the show. If you like the Extra Spicy podcast, subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Soleil Ho, on Twitter at HOOLEIL.
And me, Justin Phillips, at Just Mr. Phillips. You can support Extra Spicy and great journalism by signing up for a San Francisco Chronicle membership at sfchronicle.com/pod.